Happy Holy Hump Day on this March 30th, everyone. I'm Pastor Robert. Welcome to this midweek time where I can share some spiritual thoughts and reflections with you. And for today, I thought it would be good for us to think even more about what it means to be Jesus grace-filled disciples. That was our worship theme this past Sunday, so you can watch that worship service on our church's YouTube channel, which includes the sermon. And I talked in that sermon a lot about God's grace. God's grace is God's unconditional love, always being extended to us in any given moment. And during that sermon, I talked about the three kinds of grace that John Wesley talked a lot about. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism from the 18th century. And John Wesley saw grace in three different angles. He saw it as God's prevenient grace. And the word prevenient means to go before. And so God's grace is always being extended to us even before our consciousness of it. And then there's the other aspect of grace known as God's justifying grace. And that's where God makes us right with God. And that's that aha moment when we finally get it, that God does really love us, and we accept and receive that love into our lives. And then there is this third aspect of God's grace known as sanctifying grace, God's sanctifying grace. And God's sanctifying grace is the grace that continues to work on us so that we can be made into the people God has called us to be. And that's a lifelong process. It's not just when we're justified that is important. It's our whole life. And so even after we have that aha moment, God's sanctifying grace continues to work on us, and we continue to live in a life of God's grace. And John Wesley had this wonderful image in explaining these three aspects of God's grace, prevenient, justifying, and sanctifying, by using a house to help us think this through. So think of the porch of a house as God's prevenient grace. The house might look really nice from the outside, so you're kind of drawn up to that front porch, but you're not in the house yet. But that's God's prevenient grace. It's an invitation that God is giving us to come to the house, to come closer. And we don't know what's in the house yet, but we just know something might be there. And so that is, for Wesley, a picture of God's prevenient grace. We're on the porch, but we're not yet in the house. And then think of the door, that front door of the house, as God's justifying grace, where we open the door when we realize, oh, this is a house that I really want to see. And you have probably seen many of those home makeover shows where the people go into the house after it's been renovated, and they have this wonderful look on their faces of excitement. And so that's kind of like it is with God's justifying grace. We open the door of that house, and as we enter in, we're having that aha moment. Oh my, God's grace is so incredible, so beautiful. And we have just a sense of love and adoration of who God is, because we realize consciously just how much God does love us. We're not on the porch anymore. We're now inside there in that foyer of the house, so to speak. But we don't just stay there in the foyer for that justifying grace time there in the house. We want to explore the house because we look around and we see, oh, there's more to see. And that's what we do for the rest of our lives. We make that house our home. And we enjoy the different rooms, and we spend the rest of our lives allowing God to shape and mold us into who God is calling us to be. And we feel at home with God. So that's really a great image, I think, of God's grace. God's grace is prevenient grace, where it leads us up to that porch, but we're not yet seeing the fullness of God's grace. But we know something's there. And then we open that door, we have that aha moment. Oh, this is a beautiful house as we walk inside it. And then when we're in that foyer, we realize, oh, there's more to see. And that's God's sanctifying grace that takes us through that house, where that house becomes more of our home for the remainder of our lives. And so I think that's a great picture of God's grace. And so, but for today, I want to talk a little bit more specifically about God's prevenient grace, because I think that's such a powerful theological understanding of God's grace. A lot of times people focus on God's justifying grace and that time where we accepted Jesus into our lives and we became born again, and there's different ways we describe that. But sometimes we forget that before we even get to that moment, God's grace was already at work in our lives before our awareness of it. And it's only by looking back that we can see how God has led us to that front porch to lead us to open the front door to enter into that house of grace. And so that's why we baptize infants. Infants obviously don't really know in a full mental capacity about all that God has done for us through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But that baby, once the baby is baptized and is nurtured and cared for by the family and hopefully through a church family, that child will grow into that love of God's grace, that awareness of God's grace. And then we do have an opportunity for those who have been baptized to participate in a confirmation class when they're in junior high years or middle school years. And that's where they can affirm what was made for them at their baptism, that God had claimed them, and they can accept that for themselves through confirmation. And not just through confirmation, but through other times in our lives where we become aware of God's grace. So I think about my life. I really can't pinpoint an exact time when I had that aha moment and accepted God's grace for myself in just one specific time. I think that's happened over many times because I grew up with a very nurturing, loving, caring, shepherding church. And to me, it's almost like asking, when did I first know that my parents loved me? And I really can't point to one moment. Some people can do that, and that's okay. But for me, I just can't just pick one. I can share some examples of where I did affirm my of God's grace in my life that was made in my baptism, where I could then respond to that. So I've had a lot of recommitments of my life to Christ, but I really can't point to that one moment. And that's okay if you can't either. So just want to let those of you who don't have that one dramatic moment of accepting Christ, it's okay. Sometimes, it's a very gradual process, and that's the way God's grace often works. And so I want you to think about that in terms of God's prevenient grace. Think about this. In any given moment, on any given day, God is always reaching out to you and me with God's grace, inviting us to be in a relationship with God, inviting us to know that we are not alone, inviting us to know that God is guiding and directing our every step. I think that's a wonderful thought to remember that, but oftentimes we don't recognize that God is reaching out to us as we go through our day. And that's why I think it's important for us at the end of the day and at different times to just reflect back on our day, reflect back on our week, and see how God was present with us, even though at the time we might not have been aware of it. But now looking back, we can see God's hand at work throughout our day or throughout our week. So join us this Sunday as we continue in the Making of a Disciple Lent sermon series. We're going to be focusing on the importance of being Jesus-centered. So join us for worship this Sunday at either 9 or 10:30. Also, you can watch us live stream on our church's YouTube channel, which begins at 10:30. And that's going to be a very important topic for us as well. So may God bless you as we continue to reflect on God's grace, God's prevenient grace, God's justifying grace, and God's sanctifying grace.